Hello, everybody. What a great bunch we've got today. That's fantastic. Thanks so much for coming this Friday lunchtime. It's great to have you all here. I'm very pleased that we've got Hannah Corlett from HNNA. So I think it's going to be an interesting talk. Thank you for joining us. I should introduce myself. I'm Jemima Burrell, and I'm the curator of Now Gallery and the cultural consultant at Greenwich Peninsula. So I have a kind of very particular connection with Greenwich Peninsula, which is where the design district is, and we're going to be talking about the design district today. I love Greenwich Peninsula. It has the Thames that kind of goes all around it, and that sort of makes it the shape that it is, which we will probably talk about a little bit later on. And we're going to be talking about the arrival of 16 buildings designed by 8 different architects, which are going to be offering permanent space, purpose-built studio space for all. So it's great that we're all here to discuss this today. And anybody who's at home at the moment and working in their front room, the idea of actually having some design space, some, north-facing light space would be, I think, a treat. I think we're probably all slightly bored of being at home, and a bit of purpose-built space would go down really well. We're also going to be having conversations with 6A, David Cohen, and all the architects that have designed, who've got buildings in the design district, so look out for those. I wanted to let you know a little bit about the talk, just so that you know what your journey is. And I just wanted to let you know that I will be asking Hannah about 8 questions, and Hannah is going to be sharing her screen so that we'll have some images, which obviously I think is really important when we're talking about architecture. Most importantly, though, I want everybody to get involved. It is like being in a vacuum here. Obviously, I can see you all, which is fantastic. But later on, once we have the images on, we won't be able to see you. So you have to get on that chat and you have to give us some feedback, please. We need to know from you what you're thinking. We need questions, because at the end, Polly, I think, my dear colleague over there, Polly, is going to be asking us questions on your behalf. So please, do get us questions during the whole event. So that would be lovely. Hannah, I think I'm not going to give you a massive introduction, because I think that as we talk, it'll become apparent what your practice is about. But I just really wanted to start off with a sort of simple question, which is, how did you get involved in the master plan? So if you want to sort of screen share, that would be fantastic. I was talking to Matt Dearlove, who is the head of design for Design District and Greenwich Peninsula, and he talked about this as the intimate heart of the peninsula, that we've got a lot of tall buildings going on in Greenwich Peninsula, and those maybe are the kind of unusual element in a city. But do we want with the Design District a sort of intimate space of a different scale? So I was wondering if you could kind of talk a little bit about that, please.
Yes, certainly. Unusually compared to the other sort of both the master planners and one of the 8 architects, and very much started from the very initiation of the site. We first got involved from sort of 2015 onwards with Allies and Morrison Architects, consulting to them to do the whole of the Peninsula Master Plan, which, I mean, in terms of, is one of Europe's largest developments, certainly one of the biggest planning applications London has seen. So a huge project, and that was fascinating. I mean, in terms of our existence, we were formerly known as Assemblage, recently rebranded to HNNA, but we've done a lot of consulting to larger firms on very big scale master plans and developments, and this was a real opportunity for us, and a fascinating opportunity because of the nature of the peninsula. It's reasonably undeveloped for a central London site, and had a huge amount of possibilities. And when we first started looking at the master plan, just as a very brief introduction, here's the picture of the peninsula on the top right. It's been used for industrial uses, and therefore was quite undeveloped in terms of density and urban grain, but we very much wanted to pick up on the cues from across the water, which is not uncommon with regards to the Thames. There's a picture relating the proportions of the Tate Gallery with the opposite St Paul's you can see there. And this relationship across the water is really key. So you'll see there's a photograph of the model just showing the extent in blonde wood of the development, so huge development. And there's a relationship in this case of across the water to Canary Wharf. So the opportunity to develop something with height, which is quite limited sometimes in central London, but also with this kind of density was fantastic for us. But we were very aware that when we're doing it, there's a sense of, you can get quite potentially generic type of city in terms of a high-rise development, and it can, if done all at once, not necessarily have a heart and a sense of community which creates a destination. So as a sort of piece of blue sky thinking, really born out of looking at the time I teach at the Bartlett, and the time I was looking at a brief related to gentrification and counterculture, particularly looking at how artists often are used to stimulate an area, but they become sacrificial catalysts and end up being forced out, priced out. So they almost create the community and then are lost from it. And we spoke to the client for the Greenwich Peninsula about the possibility in this location where we knew something low-rise would be favoured by the Royal Borough of Greenwich in order to keep view lines from the park to the Dome, which they were keen on. But by creating this low area for a permanent home for creatives, doing it low cost, so rent would be kept low cost, we wanted to create this heart in the district. And we're very fortunate in that the client got behind this proposal and really supported us in it. And so we went from doing the overall master plan with Allies and Morrison to being the master planners for the design district in isolation. So doing that on our own. And then we actually, rather than doing the whole thing in an inexpensive single box, which would have been the obvious thing to do, because we wanted complexity, we wanted a piece of city, something permeable and open to the public, we actually dissected it, making it quite a domestic, intimate scale, very much in contrast with the rest of the master plan. And then in turn decided that in order to get the kind of eclecticism and variety that we wanted from this piece of city, we would divide it up into 8 different architects, not do it all ourselves, and then coordinate them through our master plan. And we create a very different approach to the master plan than you would ordinarily do, creating sort of road-tested constraints that instead of tapering what the architects could do in the normal way you see with the master plan, instead very much giving them a framework in which to innovate. So you'll see these kind of looking very dry guidance in a way on the left there. It was actually us road testing the plots, understanding what was possible, and then giving this as a sort of helpful guidance rather than a restraint to the architects. And a lot of it's frameworked about making it affordable. If it wasn't affordable, the rents wouldn't be affordable and we wouldn't get the creatives that we wanted. So it was very much steered by that. But testing a different format because it didn't have the huge, materials constraints, the massing constraints that you would often get from a standard master plan.
It's interesting. I have a much clearer idea. I think I said to you that Matt Dearlove again. He talked about Tokyo or a souk or Ham Yard. He talked about Corsa Como in Milan and London's Neil Yard, and you can actually really see that from the slide before, where you've kind of cut. You've got this block of space and you've cut it up so that there's a sense of the buildings talking to each other. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about how you cut that space up.
Yeah, it's interestingly, it looks, I mean, we probably may get criticized for the sort of almost random nature of it, but there's we wanted this intricacy so that you get different types of space. The central square is actually based on the proportions of the Royal Academy Square, which we felt was a really successful public space that isn't too large. It's not should we say intimidating, but it captures a kind of public opportunity to have a sort of formal centre, and the heights of the buildings are actually similar in scale to that square. But then there's a series of informal courtyards that around which, you know, each groupings of 4 buildings have what we're calling a working courtyard. We've always talked about the idea of, you know, somewhere where you can paint the canoe. So it's a little bit more informal, and these kind of gathering sort of semi-private spaces in terms of a collective of artists and creatives around them. And then there's a series of streets, and there's a sort of orientation to do with Chandler's Avenue, which is quite strong across the site, and this takes you through to the Tube and to the Dome, and this orientation is quite key. And then the other orientations are approximate to the site, but very much not super gridded, kind of taking the idea of the sort of medieval plan of slightly sort of organic, the sense that you might be enjoyably lost in, and that you might find your way, and then using the buildings themselves as navigation because they're identifiable, rather than setting up too rigid a structure. I mean, actually, interestingly, very interested as an architect about working with different architects and giving them a format to showcase their work. And so you'll see each building is actually identified as an individual site, so isolated from each other, so that they have almost all the elevations to create something sculptural, but that also means it's very permeable. So you've got gaps between buildings. You've also got a sort of site under construction here of the very glimpses through between the different buildings, and you capture then quite an enticing route through what would be very permeable, entirely pedestrianised, and entirely accessible to the public.
I love this shot because I mean, these buildings I love particularly because it does give you this idea of what this north-facing light is going to be like and how well that's going to work within the space. But I also think it's interesting that you're not only working with 8 architects, it's also that you have to kind of bring them together. And I imagine that you had another architect who worked looking at the spaces in between. You know, it's not just about the buildings, it's also about how do you integrate the buildings together.
Yeah, and actually the coordination of that was really an interesting exercise for us, because we formatted it very much like the sort of university crit, whereby we didn't set something across the way. We wanted people to work in isolation. We wanted them to develop their identity of their projects in isolation, their language in isolation. The framework of the master plan was very much encouraging that degree of innovation. And so they presented to us as master planner and to the client and got feedback in relationship to that. And then it was very much a kind of almost like an opportunistic coordination. So seeing as there's sort of the flux of designs developed in association to each other, realizing the opportunities, being flexible where we needed to be flexible, and doing that as a coordinated exercise rather than a dictated exercise, which is very much the way we want to work.
It's quite hard though not to dictate. I mean, you're dealing with a lot of egos here who you want them to express their best selves. So you want their buildings to be the best that they can be, but you also know that there are confines. And I imagine that budget-wise, how do you keep those architects working within the budget? I mean, that takes quite a lot of skill. How did you do it?
Well, that's actually came from the earlier slide, which, as I said, looked very dry, where it's a whole load of ratios to keep to, a whole load of square meter rates to keep to in terms of the facade. When you do a building like this, they're thin, and that's partly to have a single core, and that would service both the access but the fire escape. So it's very efficient, but they're thin so that they can be naturally ventilated and lit. And then there's a single entry and exit point. So they're super efficient in isolation, but that means they've got quite a lot of skin. And that skin, that facade, we knew would be the expensive element. So we gave quite, should we say, not rigid, but strong advice about how to keep that cost down. And interestingly, some of the architects ignored it and went away and did something, and it came back and it was immediately costed too high. And so it was a case of, I see what the guidance was for, okay. And they revisited it and then actually came back on budget with that. And there was some play, like it wasn't a straight extrusion up from the floor plan to a fixed height. So we gave a volumetric play, but people had to be quite efficient and innovative with that. Obviously, you can see the 2 slides in front of us. These are two 6A buildings, and we encourage them to slant it back in order to get sunlight into the main space. So solar orientation was very key for us in terms of the massing, but they're also both north facing. So they've taken the kind of play we had in the volume, the flexibility and a little bit of looseness, and also in height, to do something interesting in section, so that all of those gallery spaces, which are fantastic, are filled with north light, which is perfect for photographers and fine artists.
That's great. Do you want to go on to your next slide?
Yeah, this is actually a story about coordination, which I think for me is like the highlight in many respects of why we enjoyed the process. I mean, we put together a panel, a sort of, should we say, a long list of artists, and I was very keen, having looked at the work of 6A, that they really innovate with inexpensive skins for this type of project. And you know, they've done works like Sawworks and the Foundry, and I was, you know, keen to have them on board. And because each architect had two buildings, they took a different attitude towards that. I mean, our two buildings are very different from each other, so there's a kind of relationship to the site that meant that they had a different form and massing, but we played certain games of which there's a relationship. Others did much more a set of twins, identical twins. But Architecture 00 actually brought on board two of their directors. So we had Andrew Saxby and Linton Pepper, and they took a building each, and they treated it almost like a competition. So they were like competing against each other to do the most amazing, innovative interpretation of the brief. They really got the fact that we put a limited number of constraints, but that they were it was sensible to follow them, should we say, but there were certain opportunities within that. And so Andrew Saxby looked at this building, which is one that, in order to get the sort of relationship of inside space and circulation, which of course you can't charge rent for, they put all the circulation on the outside. So all of the sort of net area is rentable and usable, and people can access it freely. And then they covered it in a sort of skin to allow this kind of inside-outside space, which the image shows. And then, not in the brief at all, but because of this kind of economy, if you will, of inside and outside ratios of space, and he was able to add a multi-sports space on the roof, which is an amazing asset for the design district. And then Linton, in relationship, did the other Architecture 00 building. And for this, we had constraints which is to do with a single core. So getting up to the top floor, you're limited in terms of capacity and the height that last landing can be on. And Linton, very cleverly, in the space that we'd allowed one core, managed to do this kind of corkscrew double staircase, which means you can go higher within, and so kind of stretch that constraint that we had. In order, again, to take a top floor that we didn't necessarily know was possible, and got a 5-story building, which is fantastic. But the attitude that they had in terms of pushing the boundaries and each trying to push it a little bit further than each other was fascinating. It's really, a perfect example of how we hoped that this project would work.
I'm curious, did you learn stuff about architecture that you didn't know before? I mean, is it a really good learning experience to be working with different architects like this?
It was absolutely amazing. I mean, it was a chance. I mean, we've been going for a long time, so you have ways in which you approach everything that you try and, innovate within practice about even how you resource a project, how you put fees together, how you approach a design brief, how you present to a client. But because HNNA was sat on all sorts of sides of the table, we were coordinator of the architects, we were master planner, we were one of the architects, wearing multiple hats. It was an opportunity to see how 7 leading architects approach everything. So everything from the point of view of, seeing how the client responded to a different type of presentation, seeing how they resourced a project, seeing, how they developed in terms of their presentation throughout a series of sort of monthly sort of university style crits, looking at within house, how they obviously resourced work, and it was fascinating. I mean, I've said to several people I want to write a book on the experience. It was great, and we definitely learned a lot, really questioned our own methodologies.
I'm sure just in terms of materials as well. I mean, on every level, textures, materials, colours, you know, it's like a new palette is sort of being brought and put in front of you, which must be really interesting. Thanks very much. Everybody seems to be chatting, which is great. Please keep those questions coming. We had a discussion about, a little talk about your writing you did about Kaunas, which is the second largest city in Lithuania. And it sort of really struck me, your description of it, because you talked about a place of harmonious contradictions, which I thought was such an excellent way of describing somewhere that you obviously, it sort of struck you and you were really interested by. And I thought the whole idea of sort of how architecture layers itself and how you end up with many different styles in one place. And I was interested also in sort of urban design and how you sort of take stock from the past and incorporate it into your own designs. And how do you create kind of authenticity from scratch? Because in the case of DD, you're literally coming from, you know, there's nothing there, you're just making it.
Yeah, it's something that is very much a focus for.
Do you want to go to your next image? Is that appropriate?
Yeah, it's yeah, looking at the work of and the sort of I guess theory with regards to an overly dictated, constrained space and sort of city design has been incredibly prescriptive, and I'm a big believer, as has been well written about, of understanding that that isn't actually how we grow. The idea of that sort of happenstance meeting, of the lack of dictation on the way people use space and the way that people use buildings is very much behind our work. And that sort of flexibility, the variety, is quite hard with a site that's entirely new to initiate in a convincing way and in a very real, workable way. The obviously, interestingly, with say Kaunas, that's a city where it's got the new part of the town, which is not that new, but is actually got a very Soviet gridded, long kind of urban block format. But within that is being developed eclectically with many different periods, some incredible modernist buildings within that, but very not formatted by a master plan within the block. So you get that variety, which is really enjoyable. London's another great example whereby you have that eclecticism, that variety has kind of grown out of an organic development. We, at about the same time as I was looking at Kaunas and doing the work for the sort of European City of Culture that they had sort of employed me to come out and work with them on, and they're also going for UNESCO World Heritage listing for the Soviet era. We were also looking, took part in the Seoul Biennale, which was about cities and looking at cities with regards to how to understand them as a future development and keep that flexibility. And we were looking particularly in regards to London, because we were part of the London stand, and we were looking at London as a city to get lost in, and lost in a good way, like a positive way, like understanding that you have your own way, your own version of London. It's not the same version for everybody. And we were inspired by this sort of House of Cards games by Ray and Charles Eames. The idea that you can rebuild it from its component parts and get a different solution each time. And so we were looking with regards to how communities grow up within the complexity of London, and how that, you know, almost by getting lost, you can find yourself and you find your own collective. And this is something that as a practice we're really interested in and want to encourage. But as you say, it's hard to start empty from that point of view. And so we've actually tried to develop a process whereby we look at methods of of loose frameworks or loose collectives that allow, through collaboration, for example, with Design District, getting different designers involved, to create these kind of authentic variation, rather than, you know, something super controlled or homogeneous. I mean, this slide, which looks like a very random slide, I know, but in a way it sort of typifies what we're after. So you look at Claude Monet and the way he's developed, he's very rigid in his early work because he's kind of mastering the craft, and it becomes quite specific. But then almost once you've achieved the mastery, the ability to understand the tools you're using and the techniques you have, you can be looser. So I think as urban designers, we've kind of understood the technical side of it and understanding what things are needed and must be restrained, and then we can loosen up on the rest of it, which actually allows the sort of flexibility for interpretation. So that's something that we're always been interested in, and we're noticing it across sort of other industries too. So, you know, take the kind of EU restraints on vegetables. It has to be dictated to, and we have to constrain our vegetables to be perfect. Whereas actually you're seeing a U-turn on things like that. We're seeing a U-turn on animation. It's all been, you know, developing a perfect CGI, and now, you know, Aardman are going back to developing it by hand. And that's to almost see the beauty in the accident, the beauty in the difference, the variety, and the individual coming out of it. So these kind of frameworks are something we're really interested in and definitely trying to develop. And also, I mean, Jemima, you mentioned about materials. Again, using materials, we've all been about the perfection of the produced materials, and I'll talk more about this when I come back and talk about our buildings, but we're interested in actually using the materials that are off the shelf in a different way, so that they don't seem quite so rigid and factory made, looking at accidents that happen. Say, this is one, we're looking at the GRC panels, looking at the air bubble that they're always trying to iron out, but actually there's a thing of beauty, and they make each panel different. So it's that variety that can actually make something that is entirely new have a sense of the organic city.
I think the idea of beauty in the accident is it's a sort of refreshing thing. And I think that I imagine as an architect that actually the opportunity to experiment, truly experiment, it must be quite rare. And I also had this idea that, you know, do you as an architect get better and better and better? Is it one of those professions where you are at your peak and thinking of Jim Sterling or Norman Foster, or, you know, do they get better because, like Monet, in a way they're putting on different spectacles and they're able to, as you say, kind of really flex their muscles in terms of what they know, and that just gets kind of, you know, more profound as they grow older. And that's not a question, that's just a kind of musing. What I was also going to say is we've got lots of questions, which is really great, and thank you so much for giving those to us. That's fantastic. And I'm just kind of keeping an eye on the time. So I've got two questions which are about the new Parliament building in Baghdad, and also your neighbourhood plan in Mayfair. So what I'm thinking is, if I'm not going to ask a question there, I think if you just talk about both of those together, I think we'll get them done, and then maybe move on to some questions from people. There's one more question I'd like to ask, but if you wouldn't mind talking about those two projects, that'd be really helpful, just to give a background on why you've ended up with the ideas for design districts as well, framed in that way. That would be great.
Yeah, I mean, we were talking to Mum about the Parliament, and it's something that, we're quite well known for. It's obviously very high profile. You know, at the time we won it, it was controversial because it was an open.
We probably should just say, because I'm not sure I said, this is in Baghdad. So I think the whole political, social, you know, it's a pretty extraordinary thing to be looking at, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's an amazing opportunity. We've done some work in Iraq beforehand for UN Habitat. We won the competition to do economic housing settlements for the 2 million people displaced in the war. And we've done some very tight, significant pilgrimage sites for looking at infrastructure for pilgrims there. And so we had worked in the Middle East before, but this is a hugely, you know, obviously a post the Iraq war and the kind of introduction of democracy, the idea of doing the Parliament for Iraq is an incredible opportunity, and so, you know, we entered the competition just out of, you know, passion to be part of it. So the idea we won was, yeah, breathtaking to say the least. And then, you know, a lot of controversy about Zaha coming third and then ending up getting commission. But actually, the process was amazing. We did. I mean, my slides are slightly out of order here, but here's the overall scheme you can see on the right-hand side. The reason Jemima and I are talking about it, because actually it's quite a blank site initially. There was remains of a super mosque from Saddam Hussein on the site, but otherwise it was an airport site and quite empty. So we took the brief, and again relationships with the design district, but instead of doing a huge, large, big piece of architecture, we wanted to design a piece of city. So we've embedded a series of courtyards again with a kind of urban fabric that was low rise to encourage interaction between sort of different factions of the government. So they have their own space in isolation, but they also have lots of chances to meet and gather. Very much like a city, becomes much more flexible, navigable, zonable. You can, you know, phase it in a way you can't with a single large building. But it's the reason I've got that image on the left-hand side is actually it's inspired by the idea of designing a void, kind of courtyard housing, and a lot of housing that's in the hotter climates that courtyard based. It's very much about designing and controlling the void spaces and then having access onto them. So this inspired the design for the Parliament. And then, as with the slide before here, we're actually looking, this is a Jean Nouvel's building on the right, so the Louvre on the right, very much not ours, I wish it was ours, but looking at the idea of the skin and manipulating light and a degree of randomness and a little bit of excess. So the excess from our building came from the fact that, as well as being kind of way of controlling the light and a way of structurally supporting the building, we obviously needed to cope with the idea that it might have be attacked, so structurally it had to be over-designed. But that degree of flexibility meant that you can play and it's not all gridded and it's a much more organic feel. So
I was just going to say, it reminds me of, I don't know if you've seen, there's a building called the Museum in Marseille that has the same, not obviously the same, but a similar grid. And it means exactly, it's protected from the sun. And yet you get these fantastic shadows that come through the grid on the outside of the building. And I imagine this must be the same.
Yeah, for us, that was a bit of a, should we say, kind of slight contradiction in our desires. We wanted transparency, the whole idea of a democratic government being transparent. We took the circle because it didn't have an orientation and therefore was kind of universally facing building. But we wanted transparency, so you could both see out across Baghdad and into the debating chambers that we set up in the main central building here. But it's very bright sunlight, so this gave us that sort of degree of transparency. You can see, get glimpses out and glimpses in, but you're protected from the sun.
That's great. So, and you're going to go on and talk. We literally have probably got 5 minutes to talk about Mayfair.
Yeah, very briefly. We've just, Mayfair is the opposite. It's a very tight site. We've been just had our Mayfair neighbourhood plan adopted by the sort of local community, which is fantastic. But you can see heart of London, very dense, incredibly rich. But again, trying to take opportunities of that in the mix. We have, again, slides seem to be out, slightly out. We're actually looking at the Tyburn River within that, which you probably, maybe you can't see. If I share my screen, I'm not sure my cursor works, but there's a threaded through.
We can see your cursor.
Yeah, so we've got this area, which is actually where the Tyburn River is. And then together with, now looking in collaboration with Hopkins, BDP and Grosvenor, and working with my students at the Bartlett. This is some student work that they've been doing, looking at the development of that Tyburn River. So looking at it as a kind of offer to the people who live there, which would bring in sort of independence, creative, small occupants in a pedestrianised high street. So even with a tight grain like Mayfair, you've got that opportunity to develop and seize areas in which you can make interventions.
Just talking about the Bartlett, because we're kind of going to, I thought we'd skip a question and just move on to your teaching practice, because I imagine this is quite fundamental to sort of who you are as an architect. But also we were talking about, you know, how does the Bartlett encourage diversity? Because obviously we don't live in a vacuum here. You know, there's some really pretty horrific stuff going on. And, you know, how does the Bartlett react to that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's been an interesting exercise in recent months. A lot. Initially I taught an M.Arch in urban design for several years, which was great. And an M.Arch is sort of obviously master's level. And now I actually teach on a course which is got the very long title of MA in Architecture and Historic Urban Environments, known as Mayhew, within the Bartlett. But this is a course that takes a very different approach. It doesn't have just an intake of architects. We've got an international intake, and they have multiple different disciplines. It's an MA, so it's Master in the Arts, not Architecture, and we encourage a research-driven design process. So we don't dictate the scale that people deliver at, but they're all designing within context. It's very important that it's research-driven and that there's an understanding of that context, but building on it and responding to it and using that research to dictate the type of intervention they make. Now, obviously with COVID-19, our 31 students are now dissipated across the planet, many of them having returned to their home countries. And it's something that, you know, obviously facing a future of thinking about teaching in a different way. But what's happened also in recent years is thinking about encouraging the industry to open up. It's been, you know, it's rightly got criticism for the fact that it's become quite elitist in terms of the socioeconomic and things like the racial and gender mix. And so the Bartlett's actually introduced the Bartlett Promise Scholarships, which I think it's starting this is the first year, but it's actually open to UK and EU students from backgrounds that are underrepresented in order to pursue their undergraduate studies. And I certainly, you know, massively support this. I was fortunate enough to get a full grant and have all my fees paid for me. And I wonder who isn't getting into the industry because it's a long education and expensive. And I worry that that's going to make it more elitist than ever.
Yeah, I think the debate about the creative industries and diversity is one that needs to be addressed, and you know, we keep on needing to address it. It's as simple as that. And I know that I think one more question from me, just because I think that a few people have asked it, which we discussed, and it's the one thing we haven't really talked about, except the kind of practicalities of it, but is COVID and how it's changed our lives. I mean, obviously we're talking to you in your house rather than at a big conference or something like that. And I just wondered how you felt that it will change people's perception of design, and how, just briefly, how you feel that it'll affect your looking at architecture and design and building in the future. Just in 1 minute.
I mean, obviously, it's like it's not to undermine the travesty of the loss of lives, and how difficult, particularly, certain nations have really struggled. Having worked in Eritrea recently, to see them declare a state of emergencies, obviously very difficult. But I am a glass is half full person, and I think sometimes in these circumstances you can actually have an opportunity to think outside of the box, such that you consider, reconsider the box. And I like to think that will happen as a result of this, certainly with regards to the environment. Hopefully the improvements that we've seen in a very short time with regards to the planet and the climate and the reduction in pollutants, we won't return back to our own ways as a consequence of that. We should design differently to encourage that. I like to think it will make us think about our home in a different way. We've all spent so much time within our homes, and we should reconsider the design of those. I'm very lucky to have a garden, as you can kind of see behind me. And I feel like, very fortunate as a consequence of that. But to see the reuse and the kind of focus that people have had on outdoor, shared and public spaces, hopefully I think will mean that governments start to reinvest in those and design those so that they are much more community focused, and that will mean that in effect we consider our own front doorstep and investing in that more than we would go, spend time taking a flight, contributing to the carbon footprint that entails in order to go to, a different country to enjoy the space there. Focus on what we can do here and actually maximizing that.
That's a really good answer. And I think exactly, we all now appreciate parks more than I think we ever have. And if they're well loved and well tended and well cared for, and, are given the financial backing that they deserve, we will go on using them, I think, with respect and love. I'm going to pass over to Polly now. There was just one comment which I loved, which was the design district has a close, this is from A. Robinson, and it says he says the design district has a close feel of a Parisian bazaar with a modern look like the Hudson Yard in New York. And I know that Matt Dearlove will be very pleased, because that's one of the things that he was, he thought that there definitely was a comparison, or that he hoped that he would have in the design district, and a vessel building. And he says, well done. So yes, we're really excited to see it in real life soon. Polly, tell us, what are people asking? What are people interested in?
Well, thank you for everyone for all their questions. They've been great. One question that's come through from Mark, where did the master planning stop to avoid any unexpected or overtly expected outcome?
Good question. We put in provisos, obviously, to have regular reviews, and actually understanding that as a consequence of that, we might need to curb the design. But actually, generally, we found that we were pushing people more than we was kind of restraining them. There were some difficulties. We actually had different architects, but we had the same structural engineer in the form of Whitby Wood, and the same services engineer in the form of Skelly and Cooch, and cost consultant in terms of Atelier, and they were across all of the architects. Now, the coordination side of it within the master plan was really us as urban designers, and then the team of consultants that were across the way in order to keep budgets down, which obviously was very important. Brexit sort of happened in the mix, and that meant that obviously the price of things went up. So there was some value engineering needed to realise people's ambitions, even though costs went up. And it's a very tight site. So actually understanding the services and the construction side of it, it's all being built with very little phasing across the site. So the logistics of that, it was actually more in delivery, ensuring that we weren't restraining the innovative ideas of the architects and the innovative intention of the master plan, that where the kind of coordination really came in, rather than in the design process in terms of the kind of physical aesthetics of the architecture.
Thanks, Hannah. Also, there's a question here from Chris Haynes. Do you consider the master plan to involve some form of catalyst? And if so, what do you consider that to be?
Yeah, I think the catalyst itself, in some ways, we hope will be about kind of ensuring that we have this mix of artists and creatives. The idea that there's an energy to the place, and that almost kind of spread out to the rest of the peninsula has been really key in the design. And it's really why it's there. It's sort of like, like injecting energy into the center of the plan. Because I think that the catalytic nature of artists and creatives, the sort of way that they very much adapt, the public realm and the spaces. And to date, the area has been used, as Jemima will know, being in the Now Gallery. There's, the village fete that gets regularly put on there, and the idea that artists take over Peninsula Square is already showing the possibility that if you get the right kind of injection of use in an area, it really has an effect on the surrounding buildings. So we're hoping that the master plan of the design district actually will itself be a catalyst for the whole of the peninsula. And as artists kind of develop, grow, need bigger presence, that they would become more successful and move out, not of the peninsula as such, but within the peninsula to other areas, but that by getting them in the first place by these low rents that have been, you know, so important to the scheme, that there would be this kind of generative flow, which was the aim.
I think that's, I mean, what's interesting is, although it feels like you're working in a vacuum, i.e., you know, there's not much going on. In fact, there is a lot going on. We've got the sculptural tide, which is a sculptural walkway which goes from Peninsula Square to the river, and we've also got Now Gallery. And I think that for us, it's like, oh, it's just going to be fantastic that we're going to have this space behind us that's going to be filled with creators, and certainly for the gallery, it's going to be a massive increase in terms of, you know, having a creative centre to Greenwich Peninsula. So I think there are things that you rub up against, and I think it's going to be very exciting when you're there and we can walk around and be there.
Yeah, and certainly the client was so keen not to have a sort of genericized, brand-driven piece of city. So even the market in the centre of the plan is very much focused towards independence, so that you can get that, you know, identify that this as being, you know, not, dare I say, not kind of Starbucks could be anywhere type of offer, but also to kind of create that sense of community where people belong to a place. So yeah, I mean, very, very anti kind of an offer that you'd get elsewhere, to get a sort of real identity to the peninsula, which has its own identity just in terms of the geography, as Jemima was saying, it's kind of the way that the river wraps around, and yet it's so well connected. It's a real place in the city, and I think the design district is a destination within that.
Brilliant, thank you so much. There's a question here from Rod Edwards, actually. How long would you expect to have these buildings last? Are you hoping around 300 years?
Well, that's is an interesting question with regards to the way that we build. I mean, you have all these sort of life expectancies of materials now that there's a sort of minimum requirement. But I think it's more about designing a space to be flexible, because actually the lifespan of buildings is incredibly short nowadays, because we have these kind of what I call brittle cities. I don't call it that, Richard Sennett calls it that. I steal it from Richard Sennett. The idea that the brittle city can't cope with change means you put all this money in infrastructure, and then it ends up, rather than being adapted, it gets demolished. So one of the real things we've done is to ensure that there's flexibility within the buildings, so that, I mean, just from the last few months, the way that we have changed the way that we work, and the working practices that will come out of that, the idea that we might not stick to the being in the office from 9 to 5 has suddenly been reconsidered. If you can design a space that would work from people using it on an hourly basis, in a hot desk capacity, coming in and using a meeting room and then going home, which this is very much framework to do, then you're actually looking to get a better life expectancy out of the building than you are if it's rigidly structured and suddenly, you know, society moves on.
Polly, next question.
Next question, thank you. We've got a message here actually from William Knight, and he was interested to hear about Matthew's Dear Love's comparison with other locations in London and the revival of the medieval street patterns. Is the design district experience going to be sold to public visitors, and if so, how important do you think the design district will be in promoting design generally? And he finishes there with his keeping London creative, which I'm sure some of you have seen. That's part of the messaging that we've been promoting.
I mean, as a practice, we're really hoping that we know that it might be open for sort of criticism, because it's different. You know, the thing I fear is indifference to what I'm doing, so I don't mind that. But we hope it'll open a dialogue about the way that we're designing for cities, a lot of questions about sort of, you know, capitalism, big scale buildings that aren't relatable in a kind of domestic sense, that the idea of kind of homogenous master plans that look like they're all by the same author are suddenly, it's changing the scale that our cities read at. And we're losing some of those elements, I think, that make it such that people can feel a sense of belonging, whether it be within their office, whether it be the public realm, or even as, you know, identifying as a location within the City of London. So we really hope it will sort of start to raise this discussion about the way that urban design is becoming or has become something that's operated by very few big practices and has become really reasonably stylized within that. And a lot of that can be to do with planning constraints. It's not a criticism of the practices, but the Royal Borough of Greenwich have been really supportive in this master plan, and I hope it will mean that people reconsider the way that master plans have been produced, because they have become, you know, a kind of one-size-fits-all prescriptive entity. And I think we've lost a lot about what makes London great and other, you know, older cities that have grown more organically as a result of that.
No, I think it's true. I mean, I think it's a whole interesting question about also as an architect with clients and planners, how do you go about really expressing your creativity? But I think we're probably not going to go into that now. I know, Polly, you have one more question.
Yeah, this is actually, quite a few people have asked this. Apart, obviously, from your own building, do you have a favourite building on site within the design district? I mean, not to be biased.
Yeah, really good question. I mean, I have an affinity with the Architecture 00 buildings because I loved the way that Architecture 00 dealt with the brief, and the whole, you know, their attitude has been fantastic. But I've got the 6A buildings with their north facing light. Again, just seeing the way that they developed that, those top floor spaces, which in many ways have a proportion that, you know, it's really hard to deliver elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Normally a developer wants you to maximize the floor plate and go straight up, extrude up, and then have a minimum head height so that you can get more floors in. It's almost like the antithesis of that. So you've got very narrow, incredibly tall, raked spaces, and they're glorious. So yeah, the top floor 6A is my probably go-to.
Thank you so much, Hannah.
I think the truth is you've created a sort of family of buildings, and they're all going to be in conversation with each other, which is really exciting. They're all going to have their individual personalities, and we're all going to have our favourites for sure. But I think that they're all going to work very well together. So it's been really interesting to hear you talking about that. I also love the description you talk about the heart of a community, and I think that's what we want. We want something which is, you know, the heart of a community. So you wanted to say something, and then
we actually developed it. It sounds harsh, and it actually I've recently found out it doesn't translate internationally. But we coined the phrase the Marmite building, because the understanding that it's actually important that you're not delivering a kind of range if you like them all. So it's actually important that there's some things people absolutely love and others absolutely hate. The kind of eclecticism is sort of in a way translated the idea of Marmite. And that range is really important. So having this kind of collective is what we're after.
Exactly. So we will be having another conversation with Hannah further on down the line, I think in September, and I'm afraid I don't have the dates, but maybe one of the design team can put the dates up for the talk that she's going to be about her two buildings, which I believe aren't twins so much as maybe cousins, that they don't necessarily they don't sort of reflect each other, but they're quite different. So I really look forward to you talking about that in September. So please come back for that. Also, we've got Tom Emerson, that you were just talking about their buildings, which were those ones, which I love too. And you know, if anybody's been to South London Gallery, the sort of Far Station building that 6A did there, and Milton Keynes Gallery, one of my favourite galleries in London. I mean, they are amazing architects, so do come and hear Tom talk. I think that will be really good. I think I've probably remembered everything, but Polly, do let me know if I haven't. I'm just thinking, if you haven't had your question answered, because they were about rents and stuff, I'm sure that we will feed back about that. And any other questions, I imagine we'll feed them to Hannah, and then we'll put them on our social media so that those questions will be answered at a later date. But just thank you. It means an awful lot to us, you coming at this crazy time and listening. Hannah, it's been such a pleasure talking to you and getting to know you a bit during this period as well. I've loved looking at your garden, and it's been a really interesting talk, and thank you very much for coming, everybody.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you.